Hello and welcome to this video on the supply of labour. So in this video we're going to look at the factors that influence the supply of labour, distinguish between geographical and occupational mobility of labour, and then look at the elasticity of supply of labour. So let's start off. The supply of labour, or the labour supply, is the number of hours people are willing and able to supply at a given wage rate. So let's make sure that we take this definition down. So here effectively we're talking about workers and whether they're willing to work or not. And again, we can see here that there's a relationship here between the wage rate and how many workers are willing and able to supply their labour. And what we can see is that as wages rise from W1 to W2, we can see that more workers will be willing to work at a higher wage rate. Conversely, as wages fall, we can see that people would choose to leave the workforce and would choose not to work. And the extent to which changes in wage rate affect the amount of people in an occupation depends on the elasticity of labour supply, which we'll come on to later. So let's look at this labour supply curve in a bit more detail. So we've said it's the number of hours people are willing and able to supply at a given wage rate. And here is our labour supply curve. Now, when there are higher industry wages from W1 to W2, as we said before, that is going to cause an expansion in the labour supply. Now, why might that be? It might be because workers are attracted into the industry from related occupations. They move into that industry because of the higher wage rate. Or it might be that people who have left the industry, maybe they have had taken early retirement, something like that, they are attracted back into employment, back into the industry because of the higher wage rate. On the flip side, lower wages, so W1 going down to W2, will cause a contraction in supply for the opposite reasons that we've given. Supply of labour can also shift when there's any change in the conditions of supply in a labour market. An inward shift in the labour market implies that fewer people are willing to able to offer themselves to work in a given occupation at the prevailing wage rate and salary. And so what might influence that? What might cause shifts in the labour supply? Well, there's a number of factors that might determine them. And here are 5 that we need to be aware of. So what I'd like you to do is read through each 5 and take down some brief notes. You might need to pause the video in order to do this. Well, migration will affect the labour supply. When there's increased numbers of migrants coming into a country, that tends to increase the labour supply, and vice versa when there's emigration and people leave the country. Income tax may also affect the labour supply. This could be in one of 2 ways. If income tax was raised, people might want to work more in order to cover the money that they're now paying in tax. The flip side is that actually now working becomes less attractive, and so actually supply might reduce. So it depends for income tax. In terms of benefits, if benefits are more generous, then I'm more likely to not work, which would shift supply to the left. Trade unions can also shift supply through their process of collective bargaining. So if you're part of a union as a worker, you kind of agree between yourselves that you'll only work for a certain wage rate, which can have an impact on the level of supply of labour in the market. Also, social trends. Increasingly over time, we've seen the labour force widen as for example, more and more women have joined the labour force. Now let's move on and look at mobility of labour. The mobility of labour refers to how easily workers can move to different jobs within the economy. And geographical mobility of labour refers to how easy it is for a worker to move between different regions of the country to seek new work. So let's make sure we have these 2 definitions down. And what will influence the geographical mobility of labour are a number of things. Things like housing. What about house price differentials? If one area of the country has much higher house prices than another, that might prevent geographical mobility of labour. Transport as well. If there are good transport links, people can move more easily for jobs. Also, again, immigration policy. If we look at it at a more international scale, the immigration policy will have an impact on whether people can move between countries to seek work. Our second type of mobility of labour is occupational mobility of labour. And occupational mobility of labour is how easy it is for a worker to move from one occupation to another. And really this depends on people's skills. So for example, workers made redundant in the steel industry or in heavy engineering may find it difficult to find a new job. Why is that? Because of their skills and because of their education. So let's make sure we have these bits down in our notes before we move on. So we've looked at the supply curve earlier, and the supply curve, the extent to which people make themselves available for work, depending on the wage rate, depends on the elasticity of supply. So the elasticity of supply measures the extent to which labour supply responds to changes in a wage rate in a given time period. Now, typically in lower skilled jobs, the labour supply is more elastic because a large pool of labour is available at a fairly constant market wage rate. So here, if it's a fairly low skilled job, a kind of reasonable increase in wage will attract quite a lot of people. Where the jobs require more specific skills and training, well, an increase in wage rates, because you need the training and you need the skills, actually there can't be that big an increase in terms of the number of people employed or making themselves available to be employed. What determines the elasticity of labour supply? Well, a number of factors. First of all, the nature of the skills and qualifications required to work in industry. As we've just seen, industries that require specific skills or certain educational requirements, that makes labour supply more inelastic. As the wage rate changes, the amount of workers who can work in that industry doesn't significantly change. A second one would be the vocational nature of the work. People in nursing, perhaps even teaching, tend to be less sensitive to changes in wages when deciding whether to work and how many hours to work. So again, if a sort of strong vocational job, the supply curve for labour will tend to be more wage inelastic. Lastly, the time period. In the short run, as always, the supply curve tends to be more inelastic, and in the long run tends to be more elastic. So in this video, we've looked at what will influence the supply of labour, the difference between geographical and occupational mobility of labour, and looked at the elasticity of supply of labour. That's it. Thanks for listening.